You can live in the same house with someone for 8 years, share the same mortgage, and still not know a damn thing about the soul sitting across from you at the dinner table. It only takes 1 second, one specific sound, to strip away the illusion and turn a wife into a complete stranger. Let me back up. 56 years of breathing sawdust and driving the same silver 2008 Chevy Silverado will put a certain kind of mileage on a man. I'm a freelance carpenter by trade. I used to own a pretty successful custom cabinetry shop out on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. Built it from the ground up, but I sold it a few years back. The money was steady, but time was something I suddenly needed a whole lot more of. My father, Arthur, was 78. His knees were mostly bone on bone from a lifetime of hard labor, and his blood pressure required a daily cocktail of pills that he hated taking. He'd spent 35 long, grueling years working the railroad, breaking his back in all weather, just so I could have a shot at a decent life after my mother passed away. He was my hero. So, when he started needing help, standing up from his chair, or remembering if the stove was off, selling my shop wasn't a sacrifice. It was just paying a debt I gladly owed. I moved my tools into the garage and took on smaller freelance jobs. It allowed me to keep an eye on him. The house we lived in, an old, sturdy craftsman on Maplewood Drive, had been in my family since the 70s. It was mine, long before Sarah ever came into the picture. Sarah, my wife of 8 years. She was 49, though she spent a small fortune at dermatologists and boutiques, ensuring no one ever guessed a day over 40. She lived for the local country club luncheons, the tennis skirts, the pristine image of a woman who had it all perfectly figured out. I didn't mind financing her lifestyle for the most part. I made a decent living, and I cared for her. But the older my father got, the more her patience thinned. To Sarah, Arthur wasn't a man who had built a legacy of hard work. He was an inconvenience, a stubborn, aging stain on her perfectly curated aesthetic. She hated the smell of his muscle liniment. She hated how slowly he chewed his food. She looked at him the way you look at a leaky faucet you keep meaning to get fixed. It was a Thursday morning, early October. The kind of crisp Ohio morning where the frost hasn't quite melted off the grass yet. The house smelled the way it always did on my work days. Strong black coffee from my battered thermos, and the sharp, clean scent of cut pine. I was at my workbench near the kitchen, hand-sanding a wooden picture frame I'd been meaning to finish for weeks. Arthur was in his usual spot, the worn-out leather armchair by the window, the one that perfectly contoured to his crooked spine over the years. He had his reading glasses perched low on the bridge of his nose, methodically turning the pages of the local paper. On the side table next to him sat his old pocket watch, a silver Hamilton he bought with his very first railroad paycheck. The rhythmic ticking of that watch, the soft scrape of my sandpaper, the low hum of the refrigerator. It was a quiet life, a peaceful routine. Then the peace broke. Sarah walked in, pacing the kitchen floor. The sharp heels of her designer mules clicked aggressively against the hardwood, her cell phone pressed tight to her ear. She was trying to secure a last-minute appointment for some deep tissue massage and a mimosa brunch with her friends. No, 11:30 doesn't work for me, Brenda. She snapped into the phone, her voice carrying that familiar, tight edge that usually meant a retail worker was about to have a bad day. I need the 10:30 slot. Yes, the one with the hot stones. I have a luncheon at 1. Right then, the dry autumn air caught in Arthur's throat. He coughed. It wasn't a polite little clear of the throat. It was the deep, rattling cough of an old man with bad lungs and a heavy chest. Sarah stopped pacing mid-stride. She glared at the back of his armchair, as if he'd just deliberately tracked mud onto a white rug. She covered the receiver with her manicured hand, her eyes narrowing into tiny, resentful slits. "For God's sake, Arthur, cover your mouth," she hissed. "I can barely hear myself think." Arthur mumbled a soft, raspy apology, shrinking down a little further into his leather chair. He reached for his glass of water with trembling fingers, trying to quiet himself. I watched the exchange from my workbench. My rough hands gripped the edge of the wood tightly. I stopped sanding. I didn't say a word. I've watched men twice my size lose an argument because they couldn't control their temper. And I learned a long time ago that reacting in anger only hands your power over to the other person. I just wiped the fine pine dust off my hands. picked up my thermos, and took a slow sip of black coffee. I told myself it was just a bad morning. She was just stressed about her schedule. I need to grab some firewood from the back, I said, my voice steady, breaking the thick tension in the room. Getting a bit drafty in here. Arthur nodded without looking up from his paper, offering a weak smile. Take your time, Robbie. Sarah didn't even look at me. She was already back to negotiating her spa schedule, pacing toward the hallway. Just don't track sawdust into the foyer again, she muttered. I pulled on my heavy canvas jacket and stepped out the back door into the crisp, biting yard, closing the heavy wooden door gently behind me. I left them there in the living room. It was exactly 10:11 a.m. What I didn't know yet was that by the time I came back inside, the life I'd built over the last 8 years would be completely, irreversibly dead. I stood in the backyard, letting the biting October wind clear my head. The air smelled of damp earth and the coming winter. I walked over to the cord of oak stacked against the cedar fence, picking up 3 heavy split logs. The rough bark scraped familiarly against my calloused palms. I was just calculating how much weather striping I'd need to buy for Arthur's bedroom window when the sound hit me. It wasn't a simple thud. It was the terrifying heavy impact of deadweight meeting a solid hardwood floor, immediately followed by the sharp, violent shatter of glass. It was the kind of noise that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the heart. I dropped the firewood. It hit the frost-covered grass with a dull thud. I checked my wristwatch as I sprinted toward the house. 10:14 a.m. I burst through the back door, the heavy wood slamming hard against the wall. Dad. The sight that greeted me made my blood run completely cold. Arthur was on the floor, lying awkwardly in the threshold between the living room and the kitchen. He was curled into a fetal position, his frail, gnarled hands clutching his right side. His breath was coming in ragged, agonizing gasps. His face, usually weathered and warm, was entirely devoid of color and twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated pain. His wooden walking cane had skittered halfway across the room, completely out of his reach. And there, lying just inches from his trembling fingers, was his silver Hamilton pocket watch. The crystal face was entirely shattered, heavily spiderwebbed with cracks, with tiny shards of glass glittering sharply on the oak floorboards. The steady, rhythmic ticking that had been the soundtrack of my entire childhood had stopped dead. Panic surged in my chest. I started to rush forward, my mind rapidly cycling through CPR protocols. Terrified, his weak heart had finally given out. But then my eyes tracked upward, and the panic vanished, instantly replaced by something much darker. Sarah was there. She wasn't pulling her phone out to dial 911. She wasn't kneeling beside him, trying to soothe the terrified old man who had treated her with nothing but quiet respect for 8 years. She was standing by the console table in the foyer, exactly 3 feet away from my father. She was using the wall for balance as she casually slid a strappy designer high heel onto her left foot. She smoothed down the lapels of her expensive cream-colored wool coat, her face a mask of absolute chilling indifference. The thick, floral scent of her high-end perfume hung heavily in the air, a sickening contrast to the smell of old age and sudden tragedy. I froze. My brain simply couldn't process the geometry of the scene. A man was gasping in agony on the floor, and his daughter-in-law was checking her reflection in the hall mirror. She noticed me standing in the doorway and let out a short, annoyed sigh. Not a gasp of horror. Not a cry for help, a sigh of sheer inconvenience. She looked down at Arthur, then up at me, her eyes flat and empty. "I'm late for my brunch, Robert," she said. Her voice was perfectly level, completely devoid of a single ounce of empathy. "Handle it yourself. He's your problem, not mine." And then, with the casual, irritated grace of someone avoiding a muddy puddle on the sidewalk, Sarah lifted her designer heel and literally stepped over my father's trembling legs to reach the front door. I didn't say a word. I didn't yell. I didn't demand she stay and help. I just looked at her. For 3 long, agonizing seconds, our eyes locked across the room. There is a specific kind of clarity that washes over a man when he realizes the person he sleeps next to is entirely devoid of humanity. When you work with wood, your whole life, you learn how to identify structural rot. You don't scream at a rotting support beam. You don't try to reason with it, and you sure as hell don't try to paint over it to make it look pretty. You cut it out. Cleanly, quietly, and permanently. In those 3 seconds, every ounce of love, tolerance, and patience I had ever held for that woman evaporated. The anger in my chest crystallized into an absolute, unbreakable block of ice. She broke the stare, unfazed, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. She grabbed her car keys from the ceramic dish. The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind her. A few seconds later, the engine of her Lexus purred to life, and the crunch of gravel signaled her departure to drink mimosas. Pause here for a second. I want to ask you a serious question. Where do you draw the line in your marriage? We all have boundaries, things we say we'll never tolerate. But if you have ever had to stand in a room and watch someone you love more than life itself get treated like literal garbage by the person who swore to be your partner, then you know exactly what was running through my veins in that moment. Drop a comment below. Tell me what your absolute deal breaker is, because the choice I made next changed the trajectory of all our lives. The sound of her tires fading down Maplewood Drive snapped me back to the reality of the room. The silence of the house rushed back in, broken only by the horrifying sound of my father's pained wheezing. I crossed the room in 2 strides and dropped to my knees beside him, uncaring as the sharp shards of the broken pocket watch bit through the denim of my jeans and into my skin. "I've got you, Dad," I whispered, my voice rough but remarkably steady. "I'm right here. You're going to be okay." His skin was cold and clammy to the touch. He tried to force a brave smile, tried to mumble a raspy apology for causing a fuss, but a sharp intake of breath cut his words short as he clutched his ribs. I carefully slid my arm under his shoulders, supporting his fragile frame without jostling his chest, and reached into my pocket for my phone. As I held my father on that cold floor, surrounded by shattered glass and the fading scent of designer perfume, one thing became absolutely, undeniably certain. Sarah Vance was never stepping foot inside this house again. The drive to St. Jude Medical Center was a blur of gray asphalt and quiet agony. I kept one hand on the steering wheel of the Silverado and the other firmly resting on my father's shoulder, trying to absorb some of the shock radiating through his frail body. He spent the entire 15-minute drive trying to apologize. Between ragged breaths, he kept whispering that he was sorry for ruining the morning, sorry for being a burden, sorry for upsetting Sarah. Every raspy apology felt like a nail being driven straight into my chest. At 10:45 a.m., the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room washed over us. A tired-looking doctor with a clipboard stood at the foot of Arthur's hospital bed, studying an X-ray illuminated on a nearby monitor. 2 fractured ribs on the right side, the doctor said, his voice carrying that practiced clinical distance. At his age, and with his bone density, it's going to be a very painful recovery. We need to monitor his breathing to ensure no fluid builds up in the lungs. We're going to administer a nerve block now to help manage the sharpest of the pain. I nodded, pulling a plastic chair closer to the bed. A young nurse stepped in, prepping a long syringe. I watched my father's deeply lined, age-spotted hand instinctively grip the thin hospital blanket. His knuckles turned a stark white as the needle pierced the skin near his ribs. I saw his jaw clench, his eyes squeezing shut to hold back a groan. He was trying to be strong, just like he had been his entire life. As I sat there, bearing witness to his pain, my phone buzzed in my heavy canvas jacket. I pulled it out. A notification flashed across the screen. It was an update from a shared social media app we both used to keep up with extended family. It was Sarah's account. She had posted a crisp, high-definition photo. The image showed a golden mimosa, sweating in a crystal flute, resting on a polished marble table. Next to the glass, her perfectly manicured fingers were displayed, the fresh polish gleaming under expensive lighting. The caption beneath it read, "Much-needed self-care morning. Surrounded by good vibes only." I stared at the glowing screen, and then I looked up at the IV line, currently feeding medication into my father's bruised, fragile arm. I looked at the contrast between the two realities existing in the exact same minute, the sheer, terrifying disconnect of it all. There is a moment in every man's life when the fog clears completely, when you stop making excuses for the people you love and finally see them exactly for who they are. I didn't feel a sudden rush of dramatic rage. I didn't want to throw my phone against the wall. What I felt was a profound, chilling emptiness regarding the woman I had married. The final tether simply snapped once the painkillers took hold, and Arthur's breathing slowed into a restless drug-induced sleep. I walked out through the sliding glass doors of the ER. The biting October wind hit my face, but I barely registered the temperature. I climbed into the cab of my truck. The familiar smell of old leather and stale coffee usually calmed me, but today it was just a workspace. The digital clock on the dashboard read 11:15 a.m. I gripped the steering wheel, running my thumbs over the worn leather. A different kind of man might have called his wife right then. He might have screamed at her, demanded she come to the hospital, begged her to show a shred of basic human decency. I didn't dial her number. I opened my contacts and called David, the branch manager at the local bank I'd used for 3 decades. "Robert," David answered warmly. "What can I do for you today?" "David, I need to make some immediate adjustments to my accounts," I said, my voice perfectly flat. I knew exactly where I stood financially. The proceeds from selling my custom cabinetry shop, along with my life savings, were in a sole account under my name, but we shared a joint checking account for household expenses. I need to transfer my exact portion of the funds from the joint checking into a new, separate account, leave whatever portion she deposited from her consulting work untouched. And David, I need you to instantly freeze the auxiliary credit card attached to my primary account, the one ending in 4092. It was the same card Sarah was currently using to fund her hot stone massage and mimosa brunch. "Consider it done, Robert. Everything okay. Everything is getting sorted," I replied, and hung up. My next call was to Miller, the attorney who had drafted our prenuptial agreement 8 years ago. I had insisted on it back then to protect my father's inheritance and my business. "The house on Maplewood Drive?" I asked as soon as Miller picked up. "It remains solely my property, correct?" "Absolutely," Miller confirmed, rustling some papers on his end. "Inherited property, legally kept entirely separate. She has no claim to the deed or the equity." "Good. Draft the divorce papers. Irreconcilable differences. I'll come by your office on Monday to sign them." I ended the call before he could ask any questions. I put the truck in drive and headed back to Maplewood Drive. When I stepped inside, the house was agonizingly quiet. The shards of Arthur's broken pocket watch still caught the late morning light on the hardwood floor. I knelt down, carefully sweeping up the pieces and placing the shattered silver timepiece securely in my breast pocket. Then, I walked upstairs to the master bedroom. Over the next hour, I dismantled her presence in my home. I pulled her set of expensive hard-shell luggage from the top shelf of the walk-in closet. I didn't act out of malice. I didn't rip her silk blouses off their velvet hangers. I didn't smash her bottles of high-end perfume or throw her shoes out the window. Chaos is the language of people who have lost control of a situation. I had never been more in command. My rough, calloused hands meticulously folded her cashmere sweaters, smoothing out the wrinkles before placing them in the luggage. I packed her jewelry, her designer shoes, her tennis skirts, and her endless rows of cosmetics. I packed it all with the same cold, calculating precision I used when tearing down a faulty support wall. Methodical, efficient, leaving absolutely no trace behind. By 12:15 p.m., 4 heavily packed suitcases were zipped shut and lined up perfectly in the hallway. I zipped the final toiletry bag, washed the pine dust and sweat off my hands in the sink, and dried them on a towel. The house felt drastically lighter, as if a suffocating layer of humidity had finally been vented out of the rooms. But the structure wasn't fully secured yet. The job wasn't finished. I picked up my phone one last time and dialed the local locksmith I knew from my contracting days. The clock was ticking, and I had exactly 45 minutes left to complete the architecture of her exit. Mike, a local locksmith I'd subcontracted dozens of times back when I ran the cabinetry shop, pulled his rusted work van into my driveway at exactly 11:45 a.m. Mike was a professional. He knew how to work fast, his hands calloused and steady, and more importantly, he was the kind of guy who knew better than to ask questions when a man's jaw was set tight. I handed him a cup of black coffee from my thermos. "Every exterior door, Mike, front, back, and the side entrance through the garage. Commercial-grade brass deadbolts. I need them swapped out before 12:30. Mike just gave a single, tight nod, strapped on his tool belt, and went to work. For the next 45 minutes, the house was filled with the harsh mechanical whine of a power drill biting through old metal and wood. To most people, it would have been a grating noise. To me, it was the sound of a surgical extraction. Every time a stripped screw hit the floorboards, every time an old lock cylinder was pulled free and discarded into Mike's canvas bucket, another tie to the last 8 years was permanently severed. By 12:30 p.m., the job was done. The new heavy-duty brass fixtures gleamed coldly against the weathered oak of the doors. The final metallic click of the front deadbolt tumbling into place felt heavy. It felt like a bank vault sealing shut. I paid Mike in cash, shook his hand, and watched his van back out of the driveway and disappeared down Maplewood Drive. I went back upstairs, grabbed the heavy leather handles of the 4 suitcases, and brought them down one by one. I carried them out through the front door, arranging them in a neat, perfectly spaced line on the covered porch. I set her designer leather makeup case carefully on top of the largest bag. The cold October wind whipped across the porch, biting through the flannel of my shirt, but I barely felt the chill. I stepped back inside, locked the new deadbolt, and stood in the shadows by the front window. I didn't pace the floorboards. I didn't pour myself a stiff drink to calm my nerves. I'd watched men twice my size lose everything, because they couldn't control their impulses and couldn't stop talking. I wasn't about to make that mistake. I just stood there, my rough hands resting in the deep pockets of my jacket, my fingers tracing the sharp, broken edges of Arthur's shattered pocket watch. At 12:42 p.m., the silver Lexus turned aggressively into the driveway. The gravel crunched sharply under the tires as she slammed on the brakes, throwing the car into park. Even through the thick glass of the window, I could see the rigid indignation in her posture. She swung the driver's side door open, her phone pressed tight to her ear, oblivious to the world around her. "Brenda, I swear to God, it is just a bank error," Sarah was saying loudly as she stepped onto the concrete walkway, her high heels clicking aggressively. Some automated fraud alert nonsense, because the charge was unusually high. "Yes, I will Venmo you my half the second I get it sorted." I know, it was completely humiliating in front of the front desk staff. She marched up the steps, her eyes glued to the pavement in annoyance, completely missing the 4 massive pieces of luggage until her shin practically grazed the first suitcase. She stopped dead in her tracks. The phone slowly lowered from her ear. She stared at the bags. I watched her perfectly curated features contort as her brain tried to decipher the geometry of what she was looking at. She recognized her own expensive luggage, but the entitlement she carried was so thick, it physically blocked her from comprehending the reality of the situation. She scoffed, a short, breathy sound of utter disbelief, shaking her head. She muttered something under her breath, stepped carefully around the bags, and marched straight to the front door. She pulled her house key from her designer purse, jammed it into the keyhole, and twisted. The key didn't turn. It didn't even slide in all the way. She pulled it out, examined the metal grooves, huffed in supreme irritation, and shoved it back in, forcing it hard against the new brass pins. The heavy commercial lock held firm. Not a millimeter of give. Frustration boiled over. She balled her manicured hand into a fist and pounded the side of it against the solid oak door. "Robert," she yelled, her shrill voice piercing the quiet autumn air. "Open this damn door. The lock is sticking again." I took a slow breath, letting the icy calm settle deep into my bones. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, but only halfway. I stood squarely in the threshold, my wide frame blocking any view of the interior hallway, trapping the warmth of the house behind me. Sarah didn't even look at my face. She immediately pointed a trembling, angry finger at the luggage on the porch. "What on earth is the meaning of this childish stunt?" she demanded, her voice vibrating with outrage. "And what the hell did you do to the bank accounts?" "My card was declined at the spa, Robert." "Declined? Do you have any earthly idea how embarrassing that was? I had to stand there while Brenda paid for my mimosa, like some charity case. Fix the card right now and bring these ridiculous bags back upstairs." I looked at her. I really looked at her. I searched her eyes for even a fleeting flicker of guilt, a split-second hesitation where she might ask how the old man she had abandoned on the floor was doing. There was absolutely nothing. Just wounded vanity and the bitter inconvenience of a frozen line of credit. "The accounts are fine," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, carrying the weight of a stone dropping to the bottom of a well. "Your card was cancelled, because it's my account, and you don't live here anymore." She froze. A nervous, condescending laugh forced its way out of her throat. "Are you insane?" she spat, crossing her arms tightly over her cream-colored wool coat. "You're throwing a tantrum over this morning. Over Arthur being a little clumsy and tripping." "He has 2 fractured ribs," I stated. The words hung in the freezing air, sharp and unyielding. "He is currently in a hospital bed, hooked up to a nerve block because his lungs can barely expand to take in oxygen." "He fell, Sarah, in agony, and you stepped over him. I was late for my appointment." She shot back, her tone defensive, refusing to yield an inch of ground. "He's fine, isn't he? He's at the hospital, doctors are looking at him. You are completely overreacting to this. Now move out of my way." She stepped forward, trying to forcefully push past my shoulder to get into the warmth of the foyer. I didn't budge. I just planted my boots firmly on the threshold. She hit my chest and bounced back a step, looking up at me in genuine, sudden shock. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the shattered silver Hamilton pocket watch. I held it up between us, letting the bleak October sunlight catch the jagged, broken edges of the glass face. "You see this?" I asked quietly, ensuring she looked directly at the splintered ruin. "This stopped ticking the exact second he hit the floor. The exact same second you looked at a dying man and decided he was just garbage standing in the way of your brunch." I lowered my hand, letting the heavy silver watch drop back into the depths of my pocket. "You stepped over the man who gave me life," I told her, my eyes locked dead onto hers. "Now, you step off my property." I saw the exact microscopic shift in her expression when the impenetrable wall of her arrogance finally cracked. The reality of the situation rapidly, violently penetrated her mind. The color completely drained from her meticulously made-up face, leaving her looking ashen and suddenly very old. She looked at the 4 meticulously packed suitcases. She looked at the heavy brass lock on the door. Then, she looked down at her own hands, suddenly realizing she had no access to the checking account, no equity in the inherited house, and absolutely nowhere to go. "Robert, you can't do this," she stammered, the sharp, commanding edge of her voice finally shattering into raw panic. "I don't have any cash on me. I can't even pay for a hotel right now." "You have the Lexus," I told her, my hand gripping the heavy oak edge of the door, slowly pulling it toward me. "And you have whatever friends are willing to pay for your lifestyle when they find out your credit line is 0. I suggest you figure it out. Robert, please. Wait." But she had used up all the waiting I had to give. I pulled the heavy door shut. The commercial brass deadbolt clicked into place with a resounding permanent echo, locking her out in the cold. I stood by the front window, hidden slightly behind the heavy linen curtain, and watched the aftermath of my decision unfold on the cold concrete walkway. Sarah didn't leave immediately. She couldn't. For the first 20 minutes, she stood shivering in the biting October wind, furiously dialing numbers on her cell phone. I watched her rigid, indignant posture slowly shift into desperate pleading, and finally, into utter, hollow defeat. You see, the thing about the country club crowd is that their loyalty is entirely transactional. They are fiercely loyal to the status, the expensive brunches, and the shared veneer of careless wealth. The moment Brenda and the rest of the tennis skirt elite realized Sarah's credit line was frozen, and she was suddenly standing on a porch with nowhere to go, that veneer shattered. They didn't have a spare guest room for a woman in a sudden, unexplainable financial freefall. Eventually, she had no choice. I watched her drag all 4 heavy suitcases across the gravel driveway, hoisting them awkwardly into the trunk of her Lexus. She ruined her fresh manicure in the process. She backed out of the driveway and drove away. From what my attorney told me a few days later, she ended up checking into a rundown motor lodge right off Interstate 70, a cheap place with a flickering neon sign and peeling linoleum floors, a brutally long way from hot stone massages and crystal champagne flutes. 3 days later, Miller finalized the paperwork. A process server handed Sarah the divorce papers right in the cracked asphalt parking lot of that motel. Because of the ironclad prenuptial agreement I had insisted upon 8 years ago, the division of assets was completely surgical. She kept the Lexus and the clothes on her back. She had absolutely zero legal claim to the property on Maplewood Drive, no right to the equity, and couldn't touch a single dime of the money I had secured from selling my cabinetry business. She walked away from the marriage with exactly the same amount of empathy she had shown my father on that kitchen floor. Absolutely nothing. It took a little over a week for Arthur to be officially discharged from St. Jude Medical Center. The doctors were incredibly thorough, while the fractured ribs meant he'd be moving a lot slower and relying heavily on his cane. For the next few months, they assured me he would make a full recovery. When I finally brought him home, navigating him carefully up the porch steps, the air inside the house felt fundamentally different. The oppressive, suffocating tension that had hung over our heads for the last few years was completely gone, vented out and replaced by a deep, settling calm. Fast forward a few weeks. It was a late Sunday afternoon, the kind of quiet weekend day, where the autumn sun casts long, warm golden shadows across the oak floorboards. I was in the kitchen. The sharp smell of fresh sawdust had been washed away, replaced by the warm, earthy scent of brewing chamomile tea. I walked into the living room, holding his favorite chipped ceramic mug. Arthur was sitting in his worn leather armchair by the window, a thick, woven wool blanket draped securely over his lap. He looked tired, but the healthy color had returned to his weathered cheeks, and the tight lines of pain around his eyes had finally softened into peaceful wrinkles. On the side table next to him, the silver Hamilton pocket watch sat proudly. I had taken it to a vintage watch specialist downtown the day after he fell. The internal gears were perfectly fine. It was built to endure. Just like the man who owned it, it just needed a brand new crystal face. Its steady rhythmic ticking filled the quiet space between us. I handed him the warm mug. He took it with a gentle, trembling hand, blowing the steam away before looking up at me. "It's awful quiet around here, Robbie," he noted, a faint, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It sure is, Dad," I replied, pulling up a wooden stool beside him and looking out the window at the empty porch. "It sure is." There were no aggressive clicks of designer heels echoing on the hardwood. There were no shrill complaints about the smell of his muscle liniment, no impatient sighs when he cleared his throat. There was just the steady ticking of a repaired watch, the warmth of the tea, and the profound, unbreakable peace of a home that had finally been swept completely clean. It's a funny thing about human nature and the choices we make. Kindness doesn't cost a single dime. But apathy can cost you absolutely everything. Before I go, I want to hear from you. Look down at the comment section and tell me, would you have given her a chance to explain herself, or do you believe that some boundaries once crossed can never be uncrossed? Let me know how you would have handled it.